Well, if I'm to be perfectly honest, really, one of the most difficult spiritual disciplines in my life, oddly enough, is prayer. Just being honest with you, that seems like that's just one of the places the enemy fights against me the most, and one of the most difficult um, areas in my spiritual life to maintain. And we really shouldn't be surprised at that, though, should we? Because prayer has such powerful potential in our lives, and there's so much that happens as a result of prayer that no wonder that the enemy would make that a priority to really fight against us. In fact, that may be true of you today. Many have given up on prayer, frankly, and if we're honest and don't bring our Sunday school answers, we probably have times when we've thought, you know what, this just doesn't work. In fact, you might want to talk about that in your group today. You might just want to share some times that you've actually questioned prayer, or that you struggled with prayer, or that you've wondered if God answers prayers, or why God didn't answer a prayer. And sometimes somebody's story around the circle might help. So maybe just think about that. Prayer, however, is an essential discipline, not in order to get what we want, right? Because that's another problem we have. Sometimes we think we know what we want, and yet what we want really runs counter to our real values, and that's why sometimes when we get what we want, we're still not satisfied. And yet, part of our problem with prayer is we think that it doesn't help us get what we want. Well, prayer is more than that. Prayer is about a relationship, about our relationship with Christ. Tim Keller said something pretty impressive. Listen, he said, prayer is essential for a genuinely lived relationship with God as Father. This is the heart of prayer, not getting things from God, but getting God. And so the big idea of this message was that prayer is essential to our relationship with God. And that's what we've been talking about, and that's what you need to talk about today. Our text was Matthew 5 and 6, where Jesus speaks to us about prayer. Think about it. His disciples could have asked him to teach them how to do anything. He could have said, teach us to study. He could have said, teach us to preach, or teach us to teach, or teach us to do miracles, or teach us to turn water into wine. But you know what they did? They said to him, Lord, teach us to pray. And in Matthew 5, 6, and 7, we have some of his instruction about prayer. And the section that we really looked at was the section that dealt with private prayer. And we believe that private prayer is essential because it reveals who we really are. It reveals our real personality, our authenticity. It reveals our sincerity. It helps us to know where we are. So our private prayer time is extremely important and a discipline that we must exercise. Now, I know that we can talk what we may call popcorn prayers or conversational prayers, and you may say, well, I pray, but I pray in the car, or I pray in the store, or I pray outside, or I pray wherever, whenever the moment hits me. And that's good. That's conversational prayer. However, understand that there also is a need for discipline in prayer. Jesus actually did both in his prayer life. There were times when his prayer life was conversation. For example, when he was on the cross. But there were times when Jesus exercised the discipline of setting a time, a place, and getting all by himself with no distractions, nothing around, where it was just he and his Father. Now think about it. Jesus had no inadequacies. He had nothing that he needed to pray for that he wanted or needed. So why did he pray? I'm convinced it was because prayer builds our relationship with God. Prayer is essential for our relationship with God. And prayer must be a discipline. So the takeaway, and really this is where you guys can talk today and discuss this with your group. Our takeaway is this. We need to learn to pray with a plan. To exercise discipline in our prayer life. To pray with a plan. Maybe you can talk about that. What's your plan? Do you have a plan? What's your structure? How do you pray? I mentioned several things that just kind of have been important in my life. For example, first of all, I might suggest you find your own room. Jesus said, when you pray, go into your room. Well, you need to find your room. That doesn't have to be a literal room. That could be outside. It could be anywhere. For me, a lot of times it's down at the river. Determine a time and a place that you can go to your room to pray. Secondly, I said pray with some structure. Find a structure for prayer. And I listed the Acts acrostic, where Acts, A for adore, C confess, T thanks, and S supplication. But it can be anything. Maybe you use a concentric circle. Why don't you talk about that and share with your group what your structure is, and maybe you can help someone else, and maybe you'll discover something new. And then third, I suggested you think about praying Scripture. You know, it's always good to pray the Scripture, pray the Psalms, pray any Scripture. And then finally, don't be in a hurry. Sometimes we don't pray and our prayer life suffers because we're in too big of a hurry. We're reminded that there are times Jesus prayed all night long. There were times he prayed long hours, and then there were times he prayed short. So here's a couple of little extra work for you in your group, okay? Consider this. If you have time after discussing all these other things, let me just give you a little something extra. Consider looking at the prayer life of Jesus. Let me give you a few hints to look at. He had a discipline of prayer. That is, he set times, and we'll give you some scriptures that you can look at about that. He spent time alone with God. Here's another thing. He prayed when he had important decisions to make. Luke chapter 6, verse 12. He had an important decision to make, and he spent the night in prayer. In Matthew 26 and Mark 14, we see that he prayed when he was in times of deep distress and great persecution. Chase that one down and look at that one. And then he prayed conversationally. Luke 23:46 is a great illustration of that, where he's praying on the cross, and in the midst of that cross, he cries out, "My Father, Father, why have you forsaken me? My God, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing." So, have fun. I wish I could be there with you. I'd love to hear your discussions. You talk about the discipline of prayer, hearing God's voice through prayer.